Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. In today's Washington, D.C., defending Taiwan is a bipartisan consensus. However, few have articulated better than Elbridge Colby why Taiwan is a strategic and military interest to the United States. A rising star in the foreign policy circle, if not risen already, Elbridge served in the Pentagon from 2017 to 2018 and helped craft the 2018 National Defense Strategy. His book, The Strategy of Denial, calls for a rapid renewal of America's defense in order to address the rise of China, a position that is not without controversy, but gaining momentum. Welcome, Elbridge.
Great to be with you, Wenqi.
As one of the strongest advocates for defending Taiwan by strengthening U.S. defense against China, well, explain to our audience why Taiwan is worth a U.S. fight.
Sure, thank you, and great to be with you and your viewers. And I think the way I approach this is as a sort of a realist in the kind of colloquial sense, not the sort of wonky international relations sense, but also looking at it from the perspective of Americans' own interests. And I think I underline this point because I think it's important for people on Taiwan to understand that the prospects of going to war with China over anything are going to be very grave for the United States. I mean, that's an incredibly dangerous decision. And so I think there's a tendency in discussions, particularly among friends like the United States and Taiwan, to appeal to sort of idealistic, sort of very high-minded kind of principles. But at the end of the day, when people are thinking about whether to lose, God forbid, tens of thousands of their countrymen, their children, et cetera, those kinds of appeals are often not going to ring very true. They're not going to be very compelling. And so I approach this problem much more through the lens of what is in the American people's, I would say, enlightened self-interest, not a kind of selfish or narrow approach. But ultimately, if you're going to ask, citizenry to sacrifice on a very large scale, obviously people's lives, most importantly, but also money, et cetera, it's really going to have to be something very compelling. And I think everybody understands that at an intuitive level. And this is also a very practical and prudential point, because I think it's very important to underline, especially as we look at what's happening in Ukraine, the American people are weary of wars. Obviously, the United States is not directly involved in the war in Ukraine, but there's money and there's a general, I would say, to use a sort of one word, miasma. There's a negative feeling, especially in the younger generations, about foreign interventions. And I actually share a lot of that because I think a lot of our interventions over the last generation were ill-advised. So I say that to start out. But I think in that context, it's important for Americans, but also Taiwanese to understand the logic for why Taiwan is important. It's a very important interest, but it's not an existential interest for the United States, but it is very important. And I would put for two reasons. And actually, if you go back as far as 1949, the reasons were fairly comparable. So one, I would say, is a geopolitical interest. What is the end goal of the United States in Asia? Well, Asia is now the center of the world again, after a number of generations. It's not Europe anymore. It's where economic power and growth are concentrated. And basically, to put it simply, Americans do not want any state to dominate such a large part of the global economy because they would use it against us, very plausibly. And of course, China is by far the most powerful state in the international system other than America. It's the most powerful state to arise in the international system since the United States itself 150 years ago. And China, it seems, it has an interest, but it also seems to be pursuing dominance of Asia. Taiwan is very important in this context because Taiwan is critical to what I think of as the anti-hegemonic coalition, which is to say a balance of power coalition, which if you look particularly in European history is very common. You look at NATO during the Cold War or the coalitions against Germany in the two world wars and farther back against France. That's what we want, ideally peacefully, but that's Japan, India, hopefully South Korea, the Philippines, Australia. Those countries, though, can only look to the United States and work with the United States as the strongest of those countries if they trust us. And so, the United States is tied very tightly to Taiwan by going back, of course, to 1949, but certainly even since the suspension of relations, by a commitment to Taiwan. And so countries, I think, will not trust us if we do not stand in Taiwan's defense. The second reason is military. If the Chinese seize Taiwan, they have broken out of the first island chain and they have uninhibited power projection.
Well, you clearly articulate compellingly the reason why America should see Taiwan as a core interest. The question is, if keeping Taiwan secure is a core American interest, then does that mean the US actually wants to keep Taiwan separate from China permanently? Because in Taiwan today, there is a question whether Americans' interest is Taiwan's interest as well.
Yes, let me be very clear, and thanks for asking that question, Wenqi. I mean, my view is a little bit different. It actually, I think, is close to the official government position, but it's different than a lot of the sort of so-called China hawks. So my view is that the problem is not with China. I have tremendous respect for China. I hope China achieves the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. I have tremendous respect for what the Chinese people have achieved. And particularly on the issue of Taiwan, I do not support Taiwan independence. I don't think that's a good idea. I think the status quo is tenable and I think quite good for people on Taiwan. And in the future, I am not against various kinds of resolutions that are consistent with U.S. interests. What I'm against is an agglomeration of power by China and a breaking apart of the anti-hegemonic coalition that would allow China to dominate Asia. And China, I believe that we have responsibilities to act responsibly towards the issue of Taiwan, which is very sensitive and neuralgic for Beijing and, of course, in Taiwan as well. But China also has responsibilities. China is too strong to expect the rest of us to just say, oh, this is a minor issue. This is the unfinished business of the Civil War. Sorry. When you become as powerful as China is and throws its weight around, these things have much greater significance. So again, I'm open-minded, and I believe we must be very clear that we are against Taiwan independence and so forth, not because I don't sympathize with the issue, but because of that strategic reality. But I'm open to that. But China has to also reckon with the fact that it is too strong to just throw its weight around and expect people to just ignore it.
Well, so it seems like you're assuming China's intention is to become the Indo-Pacific regional hegemony, right? Because of its growing power. And so taking Taiwan would be a very rational first step, and then potentially Philippines. So under that assumption, of course, it makes sense to beef up Taiwan's defense and deterrence. But what if China and Taiwan one day decided that they were going to have a different relationship and that is less hostile, more cooperative? And based on that, should the U.S. defense strategy adjust accordingly?
Well, to be clear, I mean, I would welcome, sort of calmer relations between Taiwan and the mainland. I'm not in favor of worsening relations, and I don't think that's in America's interest. I don't know whether it's in Taiwan's interest, but I think if we don't think it's in our interest, that's something that Taiwan should be aware of. If Taiwan wants to have more relations with the mainland, I mean, of course, I also look at what's happening in the People's Republic, and I would not want to be in that situation. So, I mean, politically and economic relations and people-to-people relations, I think it's good if there are certainly not negative relations. They don't need to be, super positive. I think, Wenqi, your point about my assumption is correct, and it is an assumption. It's not proof. But here's the thing. One, when you're that strong, when you're strong as China, the strongest state to emerge in the international system since America, we cannot make the wrong mistake, right? We have to guard against the downside. And the fact is that China does have strong rational incentives to become that hegemon. You look at how, here's my point. China is China, but China's behavior is very typical for a rising great power. And rising great powers usually try to create a secure geoeconomic sphere. And here's the thing. I think the behavior of China, particularly under Xi Jinping, but really going back, is very consistent. They're building a military consistent with that. They're throwing their economic weight around. They're diversifying they're using their diplomatic relationships in that way. So I think it's only rational for us to behave as if that is China's goal. Again, it's not a foregone conclusion, but we need to guard against that. But in fact, my own view is speak softly and carry a big stick, both for America and for Taiwan. That is to be very strong, have a strong shield, but also not try to worsen the situation with Beijing. You'll notice that I tend to refer to, I don't refer to China because I don't have a problem with the people of China, but I also don't refer to the Chinese Communist Party or Xi Jinping in a personal way. I hate communism personally. I don't want communism. I tend to refer to Beijing because Beijing it represents, in a sense, the actions of a state. And I look at the state in the international system. And often, honestly, when I have talked to Chinese PRC people about this, they actually kind of get it, that there's a rational logic here, that we could come to a modus vivendi, but it has to be based on China seeing that we, the Americans, Taiwan, Japan, are so strong that we cannot be bullied. Because, frankly, bullying and war can be rational if you succeed. I always point out people who live in California and Mexico, we didn't negotiate our way to those territories. We took them for Mexico, and we enjoy them today.
So I think you basically just don't trust anyone who is a superpower or is becoming a big power. And that is a really interesting sort of way of thinking because, some others may disagree. For example, last week we had an interview with Harvard Kennedy School professor Joseph Nye, who basically said, the belief in the inevitability of conflict can become one of its main causes. So are you worried that, this strategy of denial that you so passionately promote would actually provoke China into a real conflict?
I am very worried about that. I believe the security dilemma is a real thing. Here's the problem. There's no such thing as a free lunch. There are trade-offs in life. So I have a lot of respect for Joe Nye, but I have a quite different, a more realistic perspective, a classical realist perspective, which is, yes, I don't trust somebody with too much power. In fact, that's core to the American system, is not to trust anybody. In fact, Edmund Burke said, even ourselves with too much power. I would say the Americans have sometimes not used our power wisely. So yes, there is a potential self-fulfilling prophecy. So we have to guard against that. And that's why it's so important and why I appreciate this opportunity to clarify my view on the political issues of Taiwan, on the role of the Chinese Communist Party, which again, I object to on principle, but that's not my position. We don't need to change China's system of government. And in fact, I believe the Chinese could reasonably say we have achieved the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation under my strategy. In fact, the last chapter of my book, short book, and I did this advisedly, is really a message to the people of China, is to say, it's a decent piece. It's to say, look, I'm not asking for humiliation, for a perpetuation of a century of humiliation. You will command respect. We will have to treat you with respect and dignity, but you will not be able to dominate us. That might not be your best outcome if you're Xi Jinping, but it's pretty darn good. And the problem with Joe Nye's strategy and those like him is implicitly or explicitly, they will tend to not strengthen our military shield. And that will increase Beijing's rational incentive to use force, because let's not kid ourselves, force works. Look at what the Azerbaijanis are doing right now in Armenia. They are solving a very hard, long-lasting political problem. And that's really the only way you're going to solve a problem like Taiwan definitively for China is by force, I believe. Now, maybe over time there could be an evolution, but I just mean in the nearer term.
Yeah, again, I do think fundamentally people like Nye or others may believe that the military buildup with allies and, in some ways, some problems in the United States, and on top of China's own domestic challenges and their perceived external threats, will actually drive the US and China into real conflict. So, from their point of view, it's de-escalation and communication may be a better approach rather than building up this perceived military sort of, threat, right? Like, how would you argue against that? Well,
this is a very fuzzy argument. Kissinger makes us. So are they in favor of a strong enough military shield where China, this is denial. Denial is not dominance. John Niall is not saying we're going to land on the beaches of mainland China and go change the government. This is not the Boxer Rebellion. This is basically preventing China from being able to seize and hold the key territory of a U.S. ally. And in this context, I would include Taiwan in that category. So are they in favor of that or not? Because that's very clear. Because if they're not, then that gives China a rational reason to be able to use military force for all the, the jaw-jawing that happens. And people like Kissinger will often speak out of two sides of their mouth on this issue. So my point of view, I think, is the one that says, be strong, be very, very strong, but don't talk provocatively. And I think this is something that people on both sides of the American system are doing, and some people in Taiwan. A lot of Republicans will go and people calling Xi Jinping Hitler or meeting with pro-independence politicians. Of course, the president himself has cast aspersions on Xi Jinping and China and so forth. I think this is very unwise. So in the sense where Joe is saying, let's not worsen the situation, I agree. In the sense where Joe or Henry Kissinger are casting cold water on efforts to strengthen our forces, no. And often they will not be pinned down on that issue, but that is extremely important.
Well, you said you're not advocating for dominance, right? It's just denial. So right. How much is viewed as dominance? How much is viewed just as denial? Because, a few months ago, actually, you co-authored an op-ed in the Washington Post arguing that the U.S. needs to prioritize Taiwan over Ukraine, which actually prompted Taiwan's de facto ambassador, Kim Shao, to say she's not concerned about not receiving enough weapons as a result of the depletion of, U.S. arsenals, because Taiwan's weapon orders are on a separate track. And of course, she also said Ukraine's success against Russia will help deter China. So, it seems like you're arguing it's not enough what the U.S. is doing now, and it needs to do a lot more. So how much is considered okay and sufficient to be viewed as a strategy denial, but not to dominate?
So dominance is like totally hopeless. Like nobody's seriously talking about that because the People's Republic is so strong and powerful, and their military buildup is so daunting. So we will be lucky if we get to denial, which is a relatively low military standard. Think what Britain was able to do to the Germans in 1940.
What makes you think the Chinese military buildup is so powerful right now?
You look at it, but every source that comes from, including from a Democratic administration's Pentagon, is incredibly odd. Admiral Aquilino has said repeatedly that it is an unprecedented peacetime military buildup. There's nuclear breakout. Senator Dan Sullivan said recently that China's real defense spending is actually almost equivalent to that of the United States. In terms of sophistication and scale, the Chinese have the advantages of catch-up. They are operating at the forefront of human technology. They also have position. They have resolve. They care more about Taiwan than Americans do. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly foreboding. Yeah. So the RAND Corporation, probably one of the most respected military analysts in the country, a guy named Dave Ochmanek, he's actually a Democratic appointee in previous administrations. He assessed recently over the summer that the United States and Taiwan are on a trajectory to lose to China. And this is a relatively common view. You look at just the incoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Brown, CQ Brown, formerly Chief of Staff of the Air Force. His view is if we don't accelerate change or lose, we will lose. And that's China. If you look at the Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, he said, Democratic appointee, we are not ready. So this is the situation. So Bi Kim Hsiao's intervention into this discussion has been incredibly counterproductive and is very dangerous for Taiwan because it reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation and how Taiwan needs to deal with it. And also it risks undermining American political support for Taiwan because it reflects, I would say, a sort of faddish, idealistic view of Taiwan's role instead of what is really critical for Taiwan, which is to demonstrate, as the Ukrainians have, that the Taiwanese people are willing to fight and suffer, because the choice for the American people is much different than Ukraine. We are going to be facing, for the first time, not Nazi Germany, not the Soviet Union, not Imperial Germany, first time we have faced a peer economy since like the revolution in the People's Republic of China. And what Bi Kim Hsiao's intervention and others that I've seen speak indirectly in the press are basically communicating is that you are concerned with the optics and the idealistic arguments about Ukraine. The idea that Taiwan is ready and that it does not need weapons over Ukraine is totally false. It's incorrect. Taiwan is clearly unready. If you look at the RAND Corporation's assessment, Taiwan's own efforts, which would be vital for an effective defense, are way behind, way behind. And so this is the point that I'm making to American audiences. I'm saying Taiwan is very, very important, but we cannot afford to lose our military in a losing fight over Taiwan because the Taiwanese people have not prepared. And that is the situation that I think Bi Kim Hsiao and that implicit logic is pushing towards. You need to be much more ready, and we need to make hard choices to be prepared to help Taiwan defend itself. So we both need to do, the way I put it, the PLA is definitely not going to be stopped by Taiwan flag hashtags on Twitter or X. And that's what a lot of people seem to think. Xi Jinping, that guy is, whether or not Joe Biden is a realist or Xi Jinping is definitely a realist, and he is preparing for a large-scale military assault against the island, and it will be surprising because if they do it, they don't want to give us warning. So you have to be prepared, and we have to be prepared. We need to be incredibly hard-minded, and what I see from Taiwan's leadership, there was another article in the Wall Street Journal that reflected discussions with senior Taiwan leadership, same kind of point of view, is, my response and a lot of Americans, what planet are they living on in Taiwan? There is a country with 1.4 billion people that is run by a ruthless communist dictator who has a death wish for you. And you're telling me that we should prioritize Ukraine? Well, I guess these people aren't very serious.
Yeah, I think, in fairness, I don't really think she's saying, Ukraine is more important. But, to your point, I do think
that's the implication. That's definitely the implication.
In Taiwan, as you know, it's a democracy. So there's always, partisan politics as well. So while the ruling party, which is the DPP, has been advocating for a stronger defense, but the opposition, including the KMT, seems to argue the other way. And so, you were actually one of the few that were invited to have dinner with KMT's presidential candidate, Hou You-yi, just a few weeks ago. What was your impression? Did you advise him to, bolster a stronger defense?
Well, I mean, look, it's not my place to intervene in Taiwanese politics. I was invited, so I was honored to be invited to meet anybody, senior leaders from Taiwan. I think, and I talk to others from the DPP regularly as well. My view is Americans need to be prepared. I mean, to get back to your earlier question, Wenqi, probably the worst possible outcome is for Taiwan and the United States to politically provoke the People's Republic and Beijing and seem noxious and aggressive, and to be moving away from any potential peaceful path to unification, while at the same time not being strong militarily. And I fear that is a bit of the dynamic that we are on right now. It is true that Taiwan has been doing more, but it's, a Taiwanese official was telling me recently, well, we've increased our defense spending by 30%. And I said, look, that's fine, but that's totally inadequate for what the Chinese threat requires. And you don't need to prove it to me. Well, you kind of do. You really need to prove it to Beijing. And then you need to prove to the American people that you have committed enough where we are going to be willing to take major costs. And I want to actually make one other point that I think is important to take it a step further, because I think probably, if I'm just thinking as a normal person, if I were living on Taiwan, I wouldn't want to be in the middle of this great superpower competition either. I wouldn't want China to be lusting after me. But I'm sorry, that is the fact of the matter. I don't know. You can move to Canada or America or whatever, Australia. I didn't make it that way. But you cannot stick your head in the sand, because the reality is you are too centrally located and too wealthy and productive to be ignored. And so you will be a battlefield in some way. And this is I know a lot of flack in Taiwan for my comments on TSMC, which I believe are obviously true, that the United States is not going to allow TSMC simply to fall into the hands of an aggressive Xi Jinping that sees Taiwan. Obviously, that would be crazy. So we wouldn't do it. But what I'm really trying to communicate in a way that will get people's attention is, you're not going to just be able to sort of say, hey, we're going to take a pass on this. And I don't think the Chinese are saying you're going to be subject to re-education camps. So we're not going to do that to you. We're trying to help you keep your freedom. But I think there's a sense, it's difficult. It's a democracy. Yeah, okay. But China's not a democracy, and they have a military that they're actively preparing to take you over. So we can deal with the problem realistically or not.
Yeah, I do think, it is fair. But, there's also some people who question if Taiwan can truly rely on the U.S., right? So the U.S. is asking Taiwan to strengthen its defense, increase its budget. And, but, in the meantime, how much can Taiwan depend on the U.S. or trust the U.S.? Because we saw what just happened over the weekend. Congress did not include a budget to continue assistance to Ukraine as a compromise between, the Democrats and Republicans in order to avert a government shutdown. So, how much, can Taiwan really think that, they can actually, just by strengthening its defense, the U.S., will come to rescue Taiwan?
Well, I'm not going to lie to you. It's, as I said, Taiwan is not an existential interest. You're not part of the United States. So it's a very important, but it's not an existential interest. So you can rely on us as much as it's consistent with our interests and with our commitments and so forth, which is not 100%. A couple of things. One is, you definitely can, because the United States across party levels is saying China is our priority challenge. And that reflects an objective reality. And there is
that was the case with Ukraine as well until more recently.
So a couple of things, just to differ, the key thing, and this is why it's such a mistake for the current government to be on Taiwan, to be aligning very closely with the Ukraine, that more tightly that Taiwan is seen connected to Ukraine, it connects it to a separate set of political debates, whereas Taiwan is about China. China is widely seen, particularly by conservative Republicans, as the top challenge. So it's in Taiwan's interest to say, look, we sympathize with Ukraine. They're great, but we are about China. Are you going to let China take over, essentially establish a hegemonic position over Asia? Russia is a pale fraction of the threat. And by the way, I'm not in favor of cutting off Ukraine. My argument, as you know, is to prioritize the defense of Taiwan. The clear thing is to differentiate these things. And that's not what's happening. But I want to answer your question because, look, I mean, this is life. I mean, nobody in a business or whatever saying, oh, can I totally rely on you? I mean, we're not living in the dream world. We're living in a real world. Americans are going to help those who help themselves in a way that's consistent with their interests. Afghanistan, it's not a really important interest for the United States at the end of the day. China is like a central interest. And if we let China take over Taiwan, that's going to have huge reverberating effects that are very negative. However, if the costs of helping Taiwan defend itself are too great, then we're going to say, what are we supposed to do? So it's in your hands, Taiwan. The more you strengthen yourself, the more you look like Israel, or frankly, Ukraine, or Finland, or Vietnam, or whatever, the more, and not just in a moral sense, but also in the sense that it's going to reduce the costs of an American defense. And so I think the second point I would say is, what's your alternative? You're just going to sit around? Well, then you're definitely not going to get help. And then you really are at the mercy of Beijing. And I mean, for a country that's electing, I don't know what's going to happen in the election, but DPP is leading. It's a country that's moving in that direction. That makes no sense. If you're going to move in that direction, you should be at 10% defense spending. I mean, people say, oh, that's crazy. Well, I didn't make it so that China, I mean, Xi Jinping personally has associated his central project of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation with the resolution of the Taiwan issue. I mean, that's the way it is. And so what I'm telling you is I'm giving you the facts. And I'll tell you that a lot of people who talk a big game about Taiwan, I don't know if they would actually back it at the same time. What I'm telling you is I would follow through, but you guys have to do your part.
Well, it's realism. I understand it in international politics. So what's your prediction of what's going to happen in the next 18 months, right? The world is interconnected, even if you don't want to look at Ukraine in the same context as Taiwan, but somehow it's connected because the US plays a very important role. So with the growing concern and declining support among the Republicans, especially over military aid for Ukraine, and then the upcoming presidential elections in Taiwan and the US, what's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, look, the current situation in Ukraine is great for China because it ties down the United States in what's going to be a protracted war. So the best thing for China would be if we follow what Bi Khim Hsiao and others are saying and continue to deplete our stockpiles and our money and our political resolve helping Ukraine. Again, I'm in favor of a lower level support, but I've been pushing the Europeans to step up. What's going to be critical now is the Chinese are preparing for war. Whether they decide to go to war or not, I don't know, but they have all the indicators. And people say, oh, the PLA doesn't think it's ready, except for the fact that Xi Jinping is instructing the PLA to get ready and to solve the problems and is probably purging leaders in part to make sure that his commandments are being followed. So, we cannot say that we will have been surprised if they attack. And we will have as little warning as possible because they're sending 103 aircraft across the median line, so they're dulling our senses of warning. So we need to be prepared as soon as, like right now. And, I think the political situation in this country, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I'm really trying to do is make it clear why it's in Americans' concrete self-interest to help Taiwan defend itself. But that is on the razor's edge in substantial part because Taiwan is not doing enough on its defense thus far.
Well, thank you so much, Bridge. Your words are wise and probably not going to be popular in Taiwan, but they're clearly very important and give us a realistic view of how some in America are thinking in terms of this policy.
Yeah. Can I just say on this point, good friends tell each other the truth when you have a serious thing coming. And the people who are saying all the nice things to you, when push comes to shove, they will criticize it, but they will not have the power to stop it. And we got out of Afghanistan. We got out of South Vietnam. Yes, you can't perfectly trust us, but we're the only option. So we will help you. And that reflects a realistic assessment. What's happened in the last 2 years, I think, has borne out a realistic assessment. So the situation is salvageable, but you have to take your defense much more seriously.
Well, thank you again. Obviously, you wrote a whole book about it. So appreciate your thinking and real intellectual rigorous behind it.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you and take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.